Hey YouTubers, this is the GS2B reviewer coming at you with another video for you guys today. Now this is going to be a review on a particular sci-fi superhero drama that aired from 2001 to 2011. As you could read up the title of the screen, this is going to be my review on the WB CW drama Smallville. And basically Smallville chronicles the life of our protagonist Clark Kent, covering the origin story of Clark's transition from adolescence into adulthood in the years leading up to him becoming Superman as we ended up knowing him. So for the first four seasons, we deal with Clark's life, especially once he gets to high school. Clark starts to discover that he has these sorts of genetically enhanced powers that he starts discovering. Now, it's revealed that Clark came from, another planet, which we didn't know at the time being Krypton. In terms of the premise, is that the show opens up with a meteor shower that descends on planet Earth, especially being the small town, particularly being Smallville. We have this couple, Martha and John, discovering this child coming from this spaceship pod. Now, eventually, John and Martha take Clark under his wing and basically raise him for the next several years. By the time Clark grows up to become a teenager, he discovers that he has these powers that are beyond his control. He spends throughout most of the season really trying to figure out how to control his powers. And while Clark happens to be being raised as a human being, also having some gifted powers that he received as growing up. There's also, because of the meteor shower that took place that particular fateful day, we also discovered that there's also civilians that also discover, or at least also gain these powers, and eventually these normal human beings affected by the meteor rocks would also gain powers of their own, and thus making them metahumans. These metahumans also use these acquired powers at the expense of their personal gain. And a lot of the times you would see maybe some normal civilian get into some kind of freak accident or just living their daily lives, and something happens along the way, and they eventually acquire these powers that are beyond imaginable. These humans, once they acquire those powers, also use those powers at the expense of hurting others. And a lot of the times, Clark would often come out there and try to reason with them. He doesn't, try and, destroy them or kill them whatsoever. And a lot of the times, Clark's friends and family members often get victimized by these villains that are coming after him or coming after some of his close family members or friends that are affiliated with Clark in some way. Clark does what he can to protect his friends, his family members, and even some of innocent people that are being victimized by this said villain of the week characters that played throughout each episode. Now, Smallville was a show that I didn't watch on a consistent basis, but over time I did happen to rewatch this particular show. I was a little iffy, actually watching Smallville again, especially given how, because especially when it comes to the earlier seasons, Smallville kind of delves more on the teen drama aspect of the show, because the show aired on the WB at the time. So this was at a time when the WB was really courting towards that teen young adult audience, because this was just at the time when Buffy the Vampire Slayer was starting to get huge, and Dawson's Creek also came out and basically changed the landscape of the network. That was really where the WB really started to figure out, okay, so these shows are really doing well in the ratings, and we've got a young adult crowd that are really engaged in these TV shows. So why not, try and go forth with it and try to continue to capitalize on those shows by investing on more shows catered to the same young adult crowd. And then over time, we got shows like Charmed, we got like Roswell, we got the Buffy spinoff Angel, and then this particular show, that being Smallville. Even though this show was basically adapting from the Superman mythology as far as the Superman comic books that have been going on for decades, even prior to Smallville. So this was a unique opportunity for the WB to capitalize on. And, Smallville, if you look at it, you could really tell there were some influences with shows from the WB during that time. It was just definitely such a it was definitely one of the many examples of, especially when you look at a show like Smallville, it's one of those shows that you could really that you can understand why the show got popular the way it did. So acquiring some of the soap opera aspects from the previous WB shows that were popular even during that era. It's definitely, when I watched the show again, I was like very skeptic. It's like, how is this gonna work? How is Superman gonna work in this soap opera type tone or soap opera type genre? There are some things that do kind of make it seem very melodramatic, and um, especially with the whole, with Clark and Lana being kind of like the power couple, and especially throughout a good portion of the show's run being sort of like, will they or won't they hook up? Clark and Lana would start off as soulmates, and at the time of season one takes place, it turns out that Lana is already in a relationship with a high school football player named Whitney, who would only be on that show just for this season, aside from a couple guest appearances. But eventually, Clark and Lana's relationship starts to blossom as the series rolls along, before they would eventually become a couple, and then they break up, and then they get back together. So that was also a pretty significant dynamic as far as the relationship between Clark and Lana is concerned. Now, Clark would also have his best friends, Chloe and Pete. Now, Pete would only be on the show for the first 3 seasons, and Chloe would be on the show basically for a good portion of the show's run, and then eventually she departs early on in season 10. Chloe was actually one of the original characters that was only made for this show. She never appeared in any adaptations or any like of the comic books that were based on Superman in the years before Smallville was even conceived. Pete, however, was actually one of Clark's friends in the comic books, so he would eventually find out about Clark's secret later on. Clark, as far as his best friends go, so they don't exactly know about his secret abilities just yet. And it would be inevitable as the series rolls along, with Pete discovering it in season 2 and Chloe discovering Clark's powers and his secret in season 4 onwards. So it was definitely very interesting just to see, how things kind of shape out to be. We also have Lex Luthor, who would be the centric villain. When they first meet each other, they actually start off as best friends. And that was actually something very unique, kind of like one of those interesting kind of, I want to say ideas. I was looking for a much bigger word, but yeah. So what happens is that Clark saves Lex during a bridge accident where Lex was driving at a high speed, and he eventually falls under the river, and Clark has to go in and save him. Once Clark befriends Lex, it turns out, Lex spends a good portion of the first few seasons really discovering about Clark's secret, and just basically having his eye on him as far as his suspicion towards him is concerned. I definitely really like just had the betrayal between Clark and Lex. They both become best friends, at least initially early on. You also have, being John and Martha being Clark's parents, so they're the only ones that are aware of Clark's origins and basically knowing that Clark even has powers to begin with. But when Lex would come into Clark's house, he lives in this local farm, Kent Farm, so to speak, owned by his parents, especially with John Kent being the sole owner that was passed down from generation to generation. So he'd be operating the farm early on until his death in season 5. And when we see him and Lex, this will also be a common thread between the two because of Lex's affiliation with Lionel. And we do get learn a little more about that too as well. And there's some certain circumstances that happen that create this sort of rift between John and the remaining sole survivors of the Luthor family, that being Lex and Lionel. Now, speaking of Lionel, he actually owns a laboratory corporation called Luthor Corp, and basically experimenting on folks that have suffered these sort of powers, especially affected by the meteor rocks. And even he will also have some employees who would eventually acquire these powers and becoming metahumans themselves due to a number of freak accidents that would happen in a laboratory. So he's been conducting these experiments, and a lot of the times his employees start lashing out on Lionel. When we first see him, he would only be a recurring character throughout the first season, but eventually would get promoted as a series regular from season 2 up until his death in season 7. Now, as far as some characters are concerned, you also have our protagonist Clark being portrayed by Tom Welling. And I definitely really enjoyed Tom Welling's performance. This was really where he was really starting out as an actor. This would be his first big break. And originally he actually declined this role the first number of times, and wasn't really, he was pretty skeptic as far as the direction as far as the premise of the show being Superman in high school. It took a lot of convincing by some of the showrunners to get Clark to audition once again for the role of Clark Kent. And originally there was also Jensen Ackles, who was also in line for the role of Clark. And I believe Jensen was also working on Dark Angel with Jessica Alba, which was airing during that time. So that would have been interesting, just to see where Jensen Ackles' career would have been if he had played Clark. Because, Jensen, would go on to have his success on Supernatural as Dean Winchester. And Jensen would also appear on Smallville as Alana's boyfriend in season 4. So it's definitely very interesting, especially in hindsight, as far as the auditioning process for Clark's concerned. Because it's like, who knows where, Jensen Ackles' career would have been. With Tom Welling, I'm very content with his role as Clark. And I really think that he played the character very effectively. You also have Chloe Sullivan, portrayed by Allison Mack. Now, Chloe was a character that did not exist in the original comic books. She would be the original character that was just made for this show. And, basically being kind of more of what Lois Lane would eventually be, and we would get the introduction of Lois later on in the series, but it seemed like at the time that they were basically kind of making her their version of Lois. Eventually she would discover about Clark's powers way later as the series rolls along, but for now, basically she does not have any idea that Clark has his some secrets that he's been hiding. Pete would also be a friend of both Chloe and Clark, and with Pete, it was very hard to to kind of get focus on, because he didn't really get a whole lot of screen time compared to other characters on the show. So he was really underutilized. Pete was kind of like his right hand man, and he didn't really stick around for very long, unfortunately. They often be playing basketball at times. Clark would have Lex as his friend initially, and then they would have their falling out. Lex, he felt like it was very sad just to see where he would go eventually, but just coming off as like this very wholesome, cooperative friend. He was willing to kind of distance himself from his father and his questionable decisions, and really trying to make a difference. He was willing to be accepted. He didn't really have a whole lot of friends growing up, and he had like Clark to come in and take him under his wing, be his best friend. And even though John and Martha were kind of indifferent towards him, but especially with John, more particularly, but he was actually very welcome to come in and visit the Kent farm at times. Gradually, they start kind of shifting Lex to the dark side. It was definitely such a gradual metamorphosis from Lex being kind of like this good, wholesome, rich boy, and then he kind of goes off the deep end and eventually evolves into the more cold and calculated person that he would become for the remainder of the show's run. I really definitely enjoyed Michael Rosenbaum's performance really well. He really got you to sympathize with him, and then the next thing you know, he could be like this massive dick that just backstabs on his best friend. So I definitely really enjoyed Rosenbaum's performance on this show. Now we get to Lana, portrayed by Kristen Crook, who's also on the show. I know her character does get a lot of criticism, basically, of her decision makings and her incompetence at times. You gotta think that, Lana was, she had her parents that were killed during the meteor shower. But for the most part, Lana didn't really have that many friends, but she would develop a crush on Clark. But even though she's already in a relationship, technically with Whitney, Lana just kind of went through a lot of turmoil. As far as Kristen Crook's portrayal is concerned, because Kristen was already on another teen drama at the time, I believe it was called Edgemont, which is basically a popular Canadian teen drama, which is kind of like Degrassi in a way. And she was already on that show even before Smallville, and even she would actually be still on Edgemont, doing two shows at once. So that was actually very either unheard of or very uncommon for an actor or an actress to do. But I did watch a little bit of Edgemont, even though it wasn't really my cup of tea. But I did remember watching bits of it when it was on what was it, Fox Family at the time, or which is now Freeform. But they did air it for a short time. I think it was also on Encore Wham, which is kind of one of the movie channels that were catered towards more like a family centered audience. So it was very interesting to see, that she was also doing that show and Smallville at the same time. So that, I mean, you kind of like wonders like, oh wait, what is this chick doing on this show? It's like, shouldn't she be on, this other show? Kind of interesting that she was working on two shows at once. Lana, I mean, yeah, she could get pretty much on a lot of people's nerves at times, and she would always be very clingy towards Clark or clingy towards some of his friends or family members. So especially with Clark, you gotta factor in, with Lana just kind of being mostly, she lost her parents at a young age, and she didn't really have that many people to turn towards, so she had to turn towards the people that she knew the most. And eventually a lot of times she gets kidnapped, and then all of a sudden she learns martial arts, and even despite that, a lot of times she would get her ass whipped. Lana's not necessarily my favorite character, but I understand kind of the criticism that she kind of goes through. So she and Michael Rosenbaum would be on the show for 7 seasons, and eventually they would leave the show, aside from a couple guest appearances here and there. And then we also get to the parents, Clark's parents to be exact. So you have Martha, who would be portrayed by Annette O'Toole. Now, Annette O'Toole, ironically enough, was in Superman 3. And, she portrayed Lana on that particular movie. And ironically enough, she would also portray Martha in Smallville. They were going to have a different actress to portray her. I believe her name was Cynthia Ettinger. And this was during the early stages of the show's development. So there was actually another unaired pilot, and you could actually search it on YouTube. So they got Annette O'Toole to be on Smallville once they just were unsatisfied with the original actress's performance of Martha. So they had, Annette O'Toole to come in and eventually do the show. So I definitely really like Annette O'Toole's performance here. And I think things did turn out for the better. Just kind of being the voice of reason between Clark and John. And even in some occasions where Clark and John would have their kind of father-son debacles that would happen at times. So she would often be the mediator and try to kind of settle things out. Sort of like the heart of the original main characters, considering that John and Martha are the only ones that know of Clark's secret. and his origins itself. And then we also have her husband, John, portrayed by John Schneider. I mean, he had already been a known figure in Hollywood, better known as Bo Duke and the Duke of Hazzards. Now, it was definitely way before my time. I thought it was actually really cool that they brought him in, or at least the idea, since his character, at least from what I've researched, was also from the South. Kind of got you the feeling that he looks like the type of character or that type of actor that would work on a farm. So I actually thought that was a really smart casting for them to do, and bring John Schneider to portray John Kent, who shares the same first name as the actor. So yeah, I definitely really thought that was pretty good casting there. He would be on that show for 5 seasons until his untimely tragedy that would occur later on. Yeah, so Chloe is basically also Clark's best friend that shows some aspiration of working at the high school newspaper when we first when we first introduced her. Chloe has this passion of journalism, and she even has her own newspaper that she works on with the Torch in the first 4 seasons, and then the Daily Planet. So her actress, Allison Mack, portrayed the actress that portrays Chloe. Excuse me. Now, I know some people are thinking, based on what has happened in recent months. Now, I'm definitely indifferent to that. It's not something that I really want to go more into detail on. And maybe on another topic video, that could be something that I could elaborate on if given the chance. I definitely kind of felt more warmed up to her as the series rolls along, once she figures out Clark's secret. Because before that, she's often just kind of butting into Clark's personal life. I mean, yeah, granted, they were best friends. She starts discovering that Clark has his feelings for Lana, even though Chloe starts having a love interest for Clark. She begins to kind of look up some information about some of these metahumans that are plaguing their small town and everywhere around her, and she would have these sorts of bulletin boards that what she refers to as the Wall of Weird. So she would start conducting these researches about all these particular beings around her that possess these powers that she didn't realize at the time that Clark had. And these meteor rocks, which are a huge common theme early on in the season, those meteor rocks could inhabit a person's ability to act differently, just in terms of, the psychological aspect. And they start conducting these powers, and all these metahumans just use their powers for their own personal gain to lash out on this particular enemy that did them wrong in the first place. And Chloe would basically come up with these sort of like a bulletin board with the Wall of Weird. Basically, that kind of fades away once Chloe finds out that Clark does in fact have powers of his own, and eventually finding out that Clark came from another planet, which would eventually be in Krypton. But at the time, we didn't know that, even though the viewers at home already knew about the Superman mythology if they did. I did warm up to Chloe later on as the show rolled along. I don't sympathize with what the actress has done. I would have thought at the time, if I had been a viewer watching Smallville when it was initially airing, I mean, I would often wonder exactly, what if they had never brought Lois in the show, and that they decided to have, Chloe just basically take the place of Lois, being Clark's love interest, and, being that Lois was such a huge part in the Superman universe. If she and Clark had been a couple for the remainder of the series, rather than, bring in Lois and actually embrace more on the Superman mythology. I mean, compared to earlier on, where it was just really, trying to find its footing. Well, in hindsight, I'm just very glad that, that they brought Lois in and didn't make it seem like Chloe was going to take the place of Lois. They did retcon that Chloe did have a cousin, and that being Lois, so they kind of used that as a connection and their passion for journalism and whatnot. That's as far as characterizations are concerned. Now, There were some notable guest appearances from some actors, especially with certain actors like Dan Lorla, who, for those that watch The Wonder Years that are watching this video right now, you might recognize Dan Lorla as Jack Arnold. So he actually guest starred early on in the season called, I think it was an episode called Hothead. And basically that was the episode where Clark considers trying out for the high school football team. And, he has this falling out with his father, who kind of forbids Clark from playing the football team since he, has his own powers, and he feels like Clark's gonna use his powers to his advantage. And Dan Lorla, his character, is also a metahuman who develops this power of pyrokinesis, which allows him to channel the element of fire. And anytime that he gets all angry or when things don't go his way, a lot of times he would lose his temper and everything around him would be engulfed in flames. So, yeah, I definitely really, even for a self-contained episode, I mean, I did enjoy that. And, I really enjoyed The Wonder Years. I know he's always played that, that grumpy, uh, father, It just felt like there was just a lot of Jack Arnold in him that he embraced or that he channeled throughout that episode. I thought it was great to see him on there. Shawn Ashmore was on here, I think in this season. I'm pretty sure it was this season. There was an episode called Leech where Shawn Ashmore's character, Clark, would switch powers, and there's this like a lightning strike or a lightning bolt that strikes both Clark and Shawn Ashmore's character, and they end up switching, not necessarily switching powers, but more of like Shawn Ashmore's character has Clark's powers, and Clark is kind of like this normal human being, so he's kind of adjusting to him being a real human being. It definitely really advances his Clark's wish that that he wished that he was living a normal life and isn't looked as a freak or anything like that. Shawn Ashmore's character ends up using Clark's powers that were given to him and using that to lash out on his father. And even though he does use his powers for good, eventually he ends up abusing them, and everything just about the fame kind of gets in his head. He gets way over his head. Clark eventually restores his powers thanks to the same lightning bolt that strikes the two of them the first time around. Shawn Ashmore's character he doesn't get killed, because the thing with the Smallville is that there was a policy that they weren't able to have Clark kill any particular villain. Some of that holds true and some of it did not, especially the shapeshifter who eventually dies. I don't think in this season, but like a few seasons after this. But there was also another one with the shapeshifter that had a crush on Lana. The whole thing about Clark not killing any villains. So it does hold true, but there were times where they kind of bend the rules a bit. This was like just hot off the heels of the first X-Men movie, and X2 didn't come out until 2003. So Ashmore, you might know him as Iceman in the X-Men movies, so it's actually good to see him. Adam Brody, who would go on to do the OC, would also guest star on this show, and he would possess the powers of telekinesis. And there was also the season 1 finale, which was called Tempest, basically summarizing everything that's happened throughout most of the first season. There's a rift between Lex and Lionel, and Lionel finds out that the Smallville plant did not manage to turn out a large profit, and it turns out that that Lex and Lionel have their father-son falling out, and Lex even goes out his way to initiate a buyout for some of the employees that work in the Smallville plant, and also while continuing to operate his own company with LexCorp. The episode leading into that, we also have Lana's boyfriend Whitney considering to join the military, or in other terms being the Marines. So there's a high school dance that's going on, and there's also a tornado that's approaching. While Lana says her goodbyes to Whitney, while Lana heads her way back home, there's a tornado that's approaching, and she gets all overwhelmed with the tornado that's approaching nearby her. Eventually, she gets caught in the tornado. Clark finds out about it, so she goes after the tornado that has Lana inside. So the season ends with Clark making his attempt to rescue Lana from the tornado. Season 1 of Smallville, it was a basic self-contained season. It did rely a lot on some of the Monster of the Week formula, and which was a common criticism at the time. But I personally enjoyed this season overall. Just enjoyed some of the simplicity of the show and really get viewers introduced into the show, and not to do too much in a single short span of time. I mean, there are some things that do hold up, and there's some that don't, especially with some of well, it's not really a huge deal, but like in terms of the music, because you could really tell that, Smallville was from the early 2000s. So they used a lot of music in, especially for a TV show like this. And I'm kind of surprised that they managed to not go through any sort of dispute like that would prevent the show from being released on DVD or being uh, released on stream, because a lot of the times they would probably like change around the music. And Smallville did not get affected by that. So they used a lot of music that was pretty big at the time. Like they would use like Papa Roach's Last Resort in the episode Metamorphosis. They would also use Sum 41's Fat Lip, which, that was actually a pretty popular pop punk song. That was in like American Pie. So they actually used a lot of like music that was pretty big at the time. Like they used the Callings Wherever You Will Go. I'm like automatically remembered about, 2001, and, just a lot of music that was pretty big at the time. So yeah, there were some things that didn't age very well, and I mean, nothing too big of a deal, but it's just kind of interesting to kind of look back. Even some of the tiniest things that make it seem like the show's definitely aged in some ways. I definitely really enjoyed this season, and there would definitely be a lot more better seasons as the season rolls along. I definitely really like the opening theme song with Remy Zero, Save Me. It has that kind of epic feel to it. Shame that band didn't get big after this. I think they broke up after a few years. But I definitely really like that the theme song to that show. And it's really a shame that a lot of primetime TV shows don't utilize long opening credits anymore. And a lot of times you would just have the logo of a said TV show that would just show up there for like 10 seconds, and then they just go to commercial break or something. So it's just very disappointing that, a lot of like primetime shows, especially on broadcast television, don't utilize that many like actual long opening credits anymore. It's just really a shame. It definitely laid the groundwork for a lot of superhero shows after this. Obviously, you had Heroes, and then fast forward a decade later, we also have the influx of the DC TV, Marvel set of TV shows as well. With especially with DC TV being the Arrowverse with Arrow, Flash, Supergirl, Legends of Tomorrow, Black Lightning, and the Batwoman series, which is going to be coming out soon. It really popularized the superhero genre, and especially when it comes to nerd culture. Smallville also kind of harkens influence from Buffy and Angel as well, so I could really see some influence from Buffy in the earlier seasons of Smallville. I definitely really enjoyed the first season of Smallville. A great introduction to the season. A very basic season, even though it wasn't, it still took a while for the show to really find its footing. And you could really tell, with aside from some of the self-contained Monster of the Week episodes. But, there were still some things that were kind of keeping the show rolling around, with some recurring themes going on with Lex and Lionel, with their relationship, and Clark and Lana's will they or won't they hook up, even despite that Lana was already in a relationship, but kind of more as Lana and Clark being the soulmates to each other. But yeah, other than that, I definitely really enjoyed this particular season. It definitely would get a lot better as the series rolls along. So that's pretty much my review for this season 1 of Smallville. Hopefully I did manage to get as much covered as I possibly can. If this video goes really well, then I'll be more than willing to conduct a second season of the show, or at least do a second season review of the show. So thank you all guys for watching. Just leave down your comments below. What were some of your favorite episodes, favorite moments? I mean, feel free to leave down in the comment section below. Just basically, if there's any information that I'm missing, feel free to clarify down there as well. Thank you all guys for watching, and till then, this is the GSTV Reviewer signing out.